The individual soul is merged with the source of reality, connected to the source of reality, in much the same way a wave is merged or connected to the ocean. It's the divine spark, the core principle of consciousness. And the first manifestation of this divine spark is consciousness, the subject and the object, and the perception of the object. The second manifestation of this divine spark, of this soul, is the personality around itself. It wears it like a set of clothing. It's an incarnation, a person. It exists now in the world of forms and can experience life in the objective world of forms. And now it has one of two goals to decide between. The first goal is to realize its connection to the divine source and harmonize their will, the personal will, to the divine will, thereby dominating the elements of the personality and fulfilling their human task in this world, oriented toward the spirit. The second goal is to refuse this spiritual task of humanity, detach the will from its spiritual core, and subordinate the personality to the laws and vicissitudes of the objective world. The first goal is the path of the white magician, and the second goal is the path of the black magician. The white magician will achieve their goal through self-awareness and self-control. Those are the most important aspects of any spiritual discipline. The more they resist impulses coming from the external objective world and cultivate their own individual subjective spiritual impulses, the more they become aware of themselves and therefore aware of the divine spark within themselves and aware of the divine will. The more they act in accord with the divine will, the greater control they have over the personality. The greater control they have over the personality, the more influence they have over the external objective world of forms. In short, the spirit dominates the personality and moves the consciousness toward freedom. The black magician must also become aware of themselves and control themselves. However, there's a difference. There's a rupture at the realization of the divine will. When they get to that point, they instead decide to separate their will from the divine will and subjugate the spirit to the personality, the opposite of what the white magician does. They allow themselves to become subject to the lower laws of the objective world, as opposed to the higher laws of the subjective world, or the spiritual world. This is due to a miseducation of their will, a miseducation of their consciousness. They believe that the spiritual hierarchy is tyrannical, and they do not wish to follow the divine will. They view it as stifling their own personal freedom. So instead they decide to follow a path toward and within the worldly laws, the lower laws of the objective world, the external world. They think that they'll find freedom there. The white magician is attuned to the so-called law of causality. The law of causality is this idea that a spiritual idea from the spiritual world can manifest in the objective world and spiritualize the subjective world. There's a second law that the white magician is in tune with, and it's a sort of reciprocal law to the law of causality. It's the law of expediency, that the forms of the objective world, including a person, can orient themselves toward the spirit and thereby develop their consciousness. The black magician doesn't really have any interest in these laws or in interacting with them. Now there's a popular symbol for the white magician and the black magician. When the will dominates the medium of its manifestation, when the will dominates the personality and the physical form and everything that goes along with it, the thoughts and feelings and so on, this can be symbolized by the pentagram. The disciplined will stands over and above the phenomena of the world. The individual will unites with the divine will and dominates the world. This coordinates all of the elements of the human personality on all the planes of manifestation, and consciousness reconnects with its spiritual core. The pentagram of the white magician is oriented upward, recreating and symbolizing the human being according to the divine template, the original man, the Adam Kadmon. The will eliminates the individual's identification with the personality. The consciousness of the individual itself, no longer identifies with the personality, the persona, the body, the thoughts and feelings of the physical objective form, and it becomes instead identified with its transcendent divine source. The external world and all psychic forces, including spirits and angels and so on, things of the subtle world, obey and are guided by such a will. The pentagram is a sign of domination of the human will over the earth and the subtle world. That's why it is used very often in occultism and spirituality as a protective weapon against hostile forces from the subtle world. It's also a weapon for their submission. This is the law of the macrocosm and the microcosm applied to humanity. The will to refuse the spiritual task of humanity is the will of the black magician, and this is symbolized by the inverted pentagram. The manifestation of the will is purposefully detached from its spiritual core and is subordinated to the laws of the objective world of forms. It's a constant volitional orientation towards the destruction of intellectual, psychic, and spiritual unity. It is toward the coarsening of forms, the hardening of forms, and the narrowing of consciousness. This obviously leads to the ultimate and eventual division and disunion of the individual consciousness and its dissolving back into the general material of the cosmos and the spiritual world. The path of the white magician is difficult, but it leads to real knowledge and wisdom, peace and power. For the closer you are to God, the fewer laws you are subject to. The further you are from God, the more enmeshed into the objective world of forms, the more laws you are subject to. Some of these laws include things like gravity, electromagnetism, the need for nutrition and the sustaining of the material body, and so on. These are, the laws of the cosmos that we are subject to in this state of consciousness. As one moves in the direction of the spirit, the fewer of these laws exist until there is only unity, God, divine radiance, and so on. There actually is no law there. There is no will either. Without law, there's really no will. It's just that absolute reality. So will is necessary for the construction of the world, of the cosmos. Without will, there is no world. This is where the miseducation of the black magician comes in. They believe freedom and power lies in the opposite direction. Where there is will and laws of physics and biology, there is the potential for wealth acquisition and the domination of others toward destructive ends and the possibility of activity. They think they need to perform some sort of activity to gain power and wealth and things like that. So they think freedom is where there are more laws and more physicality. So the black magician makes this mistake, believes this is where they'll find freedom and power. And the black magician's ends are inherently destructive because he or she has severed their will from the divine will and acts against it. So anything they create in the objective world only increases this rupture, this distance, and will have an anti-spiritual, anti-human quality to it. So the methods of influence, of external influence and practices of these two paths are often similar. They both must dominate the elements of the personality with the will. However, their internal motives and methods of educating the will are different. Taking a step back from this, ordinary people live by impulses, which enter them from the objective world. Now, these people will not think of themselves as either white magicians or black magicians or really anything like this. We're talking about ordinary people who generally don't think of these types of things. Now, the magician's first task is self-awareness, so that these impulses from the external world can be recognized and resisted. Now, ordinary people do this and don't do this to different extents. They are generally not that self-aware, and so they get a lot of impulses coming in from the external world. And these impulses then sort of program them to react and behave and think and speak in certain ways. Now, if you cultivate self-control practice, you are on the path of a magician. White or black, you don't know yet. You are simply becoming self-aware. You're aware of these impulses coming in from the external world, and you are attempting to control these impulses and resist them. Now, the white magician will extract from these external impulses only those elements which are necessary for conscious creativity. If these impulses if they're good and aid in their spiritual journey and spiritual self-expression, they can use these impulses of the external world, like playing with Play-Doh, making something out of clay very consciously, using the cultural elements around them, political elements, material, economic elements, whatever type of elements around them to express their spiritual idea of themselves. But no more than that. They won't get lost in these impulses. They won't allow these impulses to tempt them or distort their soul or thinking, or distort their idea of themselves, or to influence them down deleterious or destructive paths. They'll have enough self-control at that point to resist being programmed by these external impulses. So the white magician must be able to recognize theories and teachings and intellectual streams that come from the external world and not from their innermost subjective spirit. These are two streams, two impulses, the external coming in and the internal. The white magician must have their own ideal and not adopt somebody else's. This ideal must then lead the magician to dominate the instruments of manifestation with their subjective spirit. They must dominate their personality, they must dominate their physical form, dominate their thoughts, dominate their feelings, dominate their ideas with the spirit, so that they can have self-control. This is the core of self-control. And the results of this self-awareness and self-control practice is inner calmness, strength, and the domination and influencing of the external world. So both the white and black magician must be fearless as well, another similarity. So the white magician must be fearless to successfully fight the enemies of humanity, fight the enemies of the human spirit. The black magician must be fearless so that they can successfully enter into an alliance with these enemies, or with ugly psychic anti-human formations, what some people might call demons or devils or things like that, the sorts of egregores, thought forms, and psychic formations and subtle entities who don't have humanity's best interests at heart. Another similarity is that both the white and black magicians must be dispassionate. The white magician, so that they will not be distracted from the fulfillment of their task for humanity, and so his passions can be sublimated toward this fulfillment. The black magician must be dispassionate so that positive passions and feelings toward humanity don't flare up and breathe life into their conscience. The white and black magician differ in their conscience. Only the white magician utilizes and listens to their conscience, whereas the black magician replaces his conscience with a commitment to evil. So the white magician does not submit to the will of others. Here's the main difference. The white magician operates from independence and self-activity, self-impulses, subjective impulses from within, which really, a self-aware, self-controlled white magician, those self-impulses, those subjective impulses from within, should be quite harmonized with the divine will. So their own will is the divine will is their own will, and they act in total freedom and in a desire to act in accordance with this divine will. He or she leads by example and follows these impulses of the spirit and conscience, leading to goodness in the objective world. You can judge a tree by the fruit it bears. The black magician prefers to remove responsibility from him or herself and from others. They don't want to shoulder this type of responsibility. having conscious freedom and choosing to act in divine will comes with a lot of responsibilities, as we'll see soon. Rather, the black magician prefers to submit to a leader or an organization and wants others to also submit to a leader or an organization, sometimes themselves, if they're lucky enough to be in a leadership position or are striving to be. But even the leader, a black magician leader, has shirked responsibility and thrown it onto someone else or some other organization, whether this organization is a government, a religious institution, some demon archlord, or just saying it's the masses of humanity or something. They shirk responsibility for what they do and displace it onto someone or something else, because he or she wishes to create obedient and submissive tools to carry out destructive actions or their destructive personal will. And he or she is one of these tools, a tool of, like a psychic formation, like I was saying. They themselves become a tool. Now, the white path is difficult. Again, it's a difficult and thorny path because shouldering responsibility is not easy. Having freedom means you need responsibility. Having all this spiritual, conscious freedom gives you a lot of influence over the world and over other people. And to create objective goodness in the world, you have to be very, very responsible with this power. And you're also responsible for a lot of the outcomes of your life. You tend to stop blaming others for things that go wrong in your life, and you tend to take responsibility for these things. It's not an easy path. Also, it's fraught with sort of persecution, as we'll see. But this difficult path of the white magician does lead to knowledge, wisdom, peace, and power, like I said before. The black magician's path is very easy. It's very convenient because you are alleviated of all responsibility. Responsibility is completely taken off your shoulders and given to some leader or some organization, and it gives you this mental comfort of going along to get along. But of course, this mental comfort and this passing off of personal responsibility onto others will enslave that person to the will of others and to the narrowing of their own consciousness. Because the more you know, the more you're aware that you've given away your personal sovereignty to someone else. And if you know that you've given away your personal sovereignty to someone or something else, you'll realize you shouldn't have done that, and then you'll try to self-correct and maybe begin walking the path of the white magician, and then you have greater responsibilities, which is too difficult. So subconsciously, you don't want to do that. You don't want to have this knowledge. You don't want to recognize this truth. You want to stay on the black path because it's easier and more convenient. And your subconscious robot animal self that just wants its creature comforts will subconsciously resist any sort of beliefs or information or new knowledge that will put you on the path of the white magician, that will force you essentially to shoulder more responsibility with more freedom. The black path will have you avoid that. Your own subconscious will have you avoid that to preserve your social status or your wealth or whatever it is that you have. This results in the narrowing of your consciousness, right? And you no longer see the relations in the cosmos, all these cosmic relations, and how the individual is connected to the divine source, how consciousness is between the object and the subject, and all of these things regarding the spiritual hierarchy and impulses coming from the spiritual world, and how to act with responsibility in the objective world and create goodness, and how it's like a big holistic system. You stop seeing these connections, you stop seeing patterns, you stop connecting the dots in your reality, and you just see things separate and categorized and Cartesian. And as long as things are all separated from each other, you can begin to break down this idea of cause and effect, so you don't have to be accountable for your own actions or thoughts or beliefs, because cause and effect have been so divided, phenomena in the world have been so divided from each other, you begin to believe that they have nothing to do with each other. So my actions don't affect the world. My actions are my own. It's my own individual life. I'm an individualist. I'm just an atom in an ocean of atoms, and I don't affect the other atoms. I can do whatever I want. And if something bad happens to other people, it's not my fault. And they cultivate this belief. So white magic on the social scale is, you can call it individual collectivity. That's basically like white magicians or people on that path acting in accord with their innermost will as responsible individuals. And because they are acting with their innermost will, they are acting with the divine will. And the divine will basically have all these people acting in the same direction. Now, they'll still be different. They'll have their differences as individualities, but their ultimate goals don't really conflict with each other. They're creating objective good in the world, and so they reach within themselves, act as individuals in freedom and responsibility. And a lot of these people who do this will basically all be acting in the same direction. So we can call it individual collectivity. The black magic path on the social scale is the opposite. We can call it collective individuality. So this actually suppresses individualism. It is suppressed by the collective principle. So while these people believe they're acting in accord with their own will and in freedom, due to the belief that they shirked the spiritual hierarchies and their laws, they shirked spiritual law, they usually believe in like whatever the leader is doing or the organization is doing, they just go along with that, and they believe that they're individuals within this big old collective that takes the responsibility away from them. They're actually, in fact, enslaved to the will of others and are working toward basically the dissolution of humanity in the worst cases and the submission of the spirit to lower laws, to the lower laws of the objective material world, which are far more constricting than the hierarchical laws of the spirit. They believe in individualism and all that stuff, but they all kind of become the same, because if they acted as true individuals, they would stand out from this crowd, and standing out from the crowd would basically paint a target on your back. You would have different beliefs from the collective, you would have different motivations from the collective, you would have different actions and behaviors and different thoughts and feelings as the collective, and it makes it much more difficult to get a job and have a salary. It makes it much more difficult for social selection to maintain friendships. It makes it much more difficult for sexual selection because you'll be so different from everybody else that you will have a much harder time in the social, economic, and political spheres. You will find your access to these spheres essentially revoked or very, very difficult. So you will choose to believe what everybody else believes. You'll choose to say what everybody else says. You'll choose to think the way everybody else thinks. And you'll basically do what you're told. Whatever the propaganda machine tells you to believe, you'll believe it. Whatever the government tells you to do, you'll do it. Whatever the university tells you to think, you'll think it. Because you are rewarded. You are rewarded with much more social selection, much more sexual selection, and much more financial support, financial reward. The black magicians who took the first steps on this easy path, giving away their responsibility to others in exchange for this salary or the easy, comfortable life, have that keep their heads down, go along to get along mentality. They don't think about the consequences of their actions or their lifestyle choices, and these people allow the more advanced black magicians to govern society. So you have these really mediocre black magicians who don't even know that they are black magicians. They don't know that they have subjected their spirit to the laws of the world. They don't realize it. They haven't achieved that. They just took these few baby steps on the black path, and the ideas of rationalism and democracy have led the masses to do this, because democracy said you can have political power. You all get the right to vote now. Capitalism said you can all have your own personal wealth acquisition without limit. And communism said a similar thing about wealth acquisition, just in a slightly different way, that you'll have all your basic needs met if you just believe what I believe. And they took these steps down this path of personal power where they think they're all going to get power for acting as individuals collectively, that enticed them onto the black path without them having to realize it or think about it. It just sort of brought them, because they don't have enough self-awareness. They just took the first few steps on the black path and they got the rewards they wanted. They have the corporate job that gives them, the most money for doing the least amount of work. They have the social selection that they want. They have the entertainments that they want. They have they have the right to vote, so that makes them feel like they have political power, even though anybody with 2 brain cells to rub together knows that your vote means literally nothing. But they believe these things, and so they took the path of the black magician. Just the first few steps got their reward and were happy with it, so they don't think, so they're not advancing down the path of the black magician. They just got the rewards of the first, what an acolyte would get, what a novitiate on the black path would get, and they stop there, and they don't have any self-awareness about this. They won't step onto the white path because they see people who walk the path of the white magician, and this path results in the white magicians becoming pariahs, essentially. They think very differently, they act very differently, they feel very differently from these other people, and they see that it's very difficult for them to get good paying jobs. If they have to make money, they usually have really menial jobs and get paid very little. It's very difficult for them to maintain friendships because they'd rather just keep to themselves most of the time, because most people are very, very ignorant and have no self-awareness, and it's essentially impossible to relate to such people. So their social selection is essentially eliminated. For the same reasons their sexual selection is eliminated, because they don't have much money and they don't talk about the boring, asinine things that normies talk about. So the percentage of potential mates commensurately shrinks with that. And they don't have a lot of political power because they know that democratic political power is fake. It's an illusion, and they don't buy into it. So they don't bother with things like protesting or voting or trying to get into the government. And they see that the government is mostly made up of slightly to somewhat more advanced black magicians. And the normies, the baby black magicians, will generally fight to keep these more advanced black magicians in power, in government, in business, wherever, because one, they have this hope that they can one day have as much power and wealth as those people, so they don't want to disrupt the ladder. They don't want to destroy the ladder of power. I don't remember who exactly said it. There's no such thing as a poor American, just a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. This is the delusion that capitalists have, that liberals and capitalists and rationalists have, is that I can one day be like those rich and powerful people if I just work hard enough, or if I become a crafty enough thief, or if I become a crafty and clever enough like a stock trader or something like that, then I can also be in that economic elite one day. So I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to take these people out of power. I don't want to change this system. I like this system. I can advance down this system if I really want to, and I can become a quote-unquote successful capitalist or whatever. So they'll fight to keep these more advanced black magicians in power because they, one, hope to be one of them one day, or they just have their creature comforts met and don't want to rock the boat. They have a full refrigerator, they have cushy couches and beds to lie down on and a roof over their heads, and they have all the entertainments and beer that they can consume, and they don't want to change that. They don't care about acting with honor or integrity or gaining spiritual wisdom or self-knowledge. These things don't matter to them. Like I said, they ignore the law of causality and expedience, these laws of the reciprocation of the spiritual impulse entering the objective world and the spiritualization of the objective world. It's not something that they're going to think about or be aware of or care about participating in. They just have their full bellies and soft cushions. They see how intelligent, spiritual, and strong-willed people fare in this world. Like I said, they fare very badly with little financial security and social selection, political power, and so on, because of the overwhelming amount of black magic that has a lot of influence in this world. And white magicians are often persecuted simply for speaking the truth. When a white magician speaks their mind, look at all the people who yell at them, censor them, defeat them, in the worst cases imprison and kill them. These normies, these baby black magicians, these mediocre black magicians, they see how people who speak the truth about spirituality, about reality, about life itself, are heavily persecuted and disadvantaged and disenfranchised and attacked by people. So that hits them in their sort of robot or animal brain that says, Don't believe what these people believe. Don't act the way these people act. Just keep your head down, go along to get along. That whole if you can't beat them, join them kind of mentality. That mentality is much, much easier than taking a heroic stance against the forces of evil. It's that quote from The Mummy, that Brendan Fraser movie from the late 90s, is it's easier to be the devil's right hand than in his path. I think that was a quote from, I think that was like a summation from John Milton's Paradise Lost, but it's very funny in the movie. But yeah, it's easier to be the devil's right hand than in his path. And most people subconsciously see that. White magicians consciously see that, and they still don't care because they are heroic individualities and they accept, okay, I'll live in poverty and loneliness, but at least I will have my soul intact and I am leaving the world better than I found it, and I'm acting and living and will die with honor and dignity and integrity, and to hell with what everybody else thinks. The normies are not going to think that way. They don't care about any of that. They don't care about dying with honor. They care about dying with a full belly of food and lots of money in the bank. That's what they care about. This kind of brings us to these sort of guiding principles that white magicians have that black magicians don't. These sort of normie baby black magicians have all of these various concepts of God that are convenient for themselves. You know, an atheist sees no God anywhere because they themselves have no guiding principle. They themselves have no governing spirit. Or they do, but they don't recognize it or utilize it or connect with it. A weak person sees God as a guardian who will give them everything that is needed at the right moment without any effort on their own part. You know? A vicious person blames God for his or her vices, that whole, he made me this way, blah, 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 I can't do anything about it, blah, blah, blah. Then there are people who seek rewards for their actions, sort of like what you could call a karma yogi, or your basic Catholic or Christian that sees God as a cornucopia or like a grab bag of gifts that will give you rewards for acting appropriately or morally. These concepts of God become psychic formations, like egregores and thought forms. A thought form, aka an egregore, it's like a real living entity that can be born into the astral world if enough people think about it and believe in it. They kind of create this entity. And so there are these religious institutions that are dedicated to these gods, these thought forms, these egregores that were made. They then reciprocate that influence onto people. So once these thought forms exist in the imaginal world, the astral world, the sort of world of human imagination, they can then influence human thought. Humans who are sort of in harmony with these ideas, you know, atheists, weak people, vicious people, people who want rewards for their actions, they'll sort of be influenced by these thought forms and become a member of, say, that religion or that way of thinking or that cultus. Now, one thing is that white magicians need to come to terms with the fact that normies may always be mediocre black magicians, at least for the foreseeable future. You know, Francis Yockey refers to them as the material of history to be used by stronger personalities, because someone who becomes more self-controlled and more self-aware influences the external world. They also influence other people. This is where the responsibility aspect comes in. A white magician knows, oh, how I feel will determine how others around me feel. Have you ever had that moment where you walk into a room with a certain emotion and then suddenly everybody else in that room starts feeling the same way, shares the mood you feel, and then you realize, like, wow, I am apparently the most powerful emotional presence in this room, and I overtook everybody else's emotional state with my own emotional state, whether it was positive or negative. You know, sometimes, like, you have a bad day, you walk into the office or into the class or into a group of friends, and then suddenly everybody else is having a bad day. Or you're having a really good day, and then suddenly everybody else around you is having a good day. This is the result of having a lot of self-awareness and spiritual magnetism, and basically expands your aura, and your aura, your energetic field, can overtake those of weaker people. So they have weaker auras. Their magnetic fields essentially are weaker, and you can like override them. And they feel what you feel, and sometimes even think what you think. So a particularly advanced magician, whether white or black, will have this influence over others. And mediocre black magicians are far more susceptible to this. They have far weaker energetic fields than, say, a mediocre white magician. A mediocre white magician can at least resist this a little bit. Really advanced white magicians resist it completely. Whereas black magicians tend to not be able to resist this at all, and they mistakenly think that they can. Well, the advanced ones think that they can, because they can a little bit. They can resist the weak ones around themselves, and they then get emboldened and think that they can resist all of them. But then they get into contact with a black magician who's even more advanced than they are, and it overrides their will. But because their will might be so similar, so destructive and anti-spiritual, that they think it's their own will. You know, it's kind of like they're tricked into thinking that their will wasn't overridden, it was just enhanced by this fellow more advanced black magician, when really it was like eradicated and replaced. Francis Yockey refers to them as the material of history that will be used by stronger personalities. He calls them the Michel stratum of society. Michel, it goes back to like the Napoleonic years. They prefer creature comforts and ease above everything, and so they instinctively commit treason. It's like part of the normie group, where their worldview is the worldview of previous ages. So they'll have the worldviews of like nationalism, democracy, economic thinking, capitalism, communism, rationalism, feudalism. They'll think in these terms and want to see society behave in these terms and write government policy in these terms and have economic systems in these terms. So they instinctively act treasonously to humanity and to spirituality and to your culture, your civilization, because they don't want to advance the culture into a new age of something that's more appropriate for the culture. They like these older ideas and want to maintain them forever because they benefit from them. Now, Gurdjieff refers to these people as machine people. They're essentially programmed by external stimuli, and they react in unconscious ways according to whatever beliefs and dispositions they've been programmed with, by propaganda, by their biology, or whatever. Because they lack self-awareness, they have no inner subjective impulses that are guiding their lives. They just have the external impulses, and they just basically do what the government tells them to do what the universities tell them to do, believe whatever they're told to believe by stronger personalities. And in the modern world, people call them NPCs, right? It's possible that they might never spiritually wake up. Maybe there will be some future age where the social and economic and political situation is more conducive to white magicians or general spiritual practitioners. And such people might become more numerous and more socially accepted, and in such a case, normies might start to become mediocre white magicians. We can hope that that will happen, but for the foreseeable future, it probably won't. Everybody, or well, the whole normie class will likely remain mediocre black magicians. So what this means for white magicians is that there needs to be a class or a subset, a critical mass of white magicians, let's say, who become essentially people who seek political power, who become authoritarians. If you take the entire population of Western civilization and Slavic civilization, I know they're two different civilizations, but they're the two civilizations that kind of exist. You know, the West is coming to its final life cycle phases. Hopefully it will be a very good one. We can get out of the mess we're in and have one really nice life cycle phase for the next 300 to 500 years. And Slavic civilization is brand new, and it's going to be the next globally dominant superpower for probably by the 24th century, something like that, and it will, be dominant for 2,000 years or so like any other civilization. So those are the two most vital and healthy civilizations that exist, which is why I'm talking about them. The other civilizations had their life cycles in the past. So if you take the populations of these two vital civilizations, the West and the Slavic civilization, you basically really only need somewhere between 400,000 to 1 million people to become advanced white magicians. And that's kind of the critical mass. It's like the square root of 1% or something is like this critical mass that was proven to psychically influence other people. I think it was the Maharishi Yogi cult who actually figured out that, like, if you have the square root of 1% of a population thinking in a certain way or meditating in a certain way, that, like, crime rate decreases in that area, and the general mood of the area improves and stuff like that. So that's the critical mass of white magicians who can become essentially authoritarian politicians who basically they can provide for the creature comforts of these mediocre black magicians if they gain power, pacify the normies in this way, providing for their basic entertainments and things, and steer the culture in a better direction with the responsibility that a white magician will inherently have. After claiming power, cutting off the propaganda machine, cutting off the bad academia, getting rid of the bad ideologies that are spread through these modes of conduct. The challenge here is that they can expect a lot of resistance because the normies, the mediocre black magicians, will fight to keep in power the more advanced black magicians. There's been a lot of propaganda for multiple generations now that have turned people against the concept of authority. People believe authority is inherently evil, that there are particular forms of government that are good and particular forms of government that are evil, which is a nonsense idea. The form of government doesn't matter. What matters is the quality of the decision makers who have political power. And the spirit of this age is the spirit of authoritarianism. So if you want to be successful, you have to work with the current spirit of the age. You become self-aware, you become aware of the divine will, like I said earlier, and you can sense when the divine will modulates, depending on what time it is, basically. The spirit of the age changes while a civilization goes through its life cycles. And right now it's the spirit of the resurgence of authority. So white magicians have to be authoritarians. I know that will probably sound contradictory to a lot of modern people because we've been so brainwashed with the ideas of democracy and liberalism that we believe authority is bad, that hierarchy is bad, that everybody should have equal political access. I don't have to explain this to an advanced white magician. If you know what I'm talking about, you know. If you don't, you don't. It's not really my concern at this point. My concern is for the white magicians who already understand what I'm saying. What I'm encouraging you to do is to not be afraid of political power. Don't be a pacifist. A spiritual person is not a pacifist. That's some nonsense modern liberal crap and rationalism that has infiltrated modern spirituality, thinking that a spiritual person ought to act in this way and a spiritual person does not act in this way. This is nonsense. A spiritual person acts as they are. The more self-awareness you have, the more yourself you become, the more individuated you become, and you will find your role in life. It's like modern spiritual people think that a warrior can't be spiritual because a warrior commits violence. This is insane. Like, imagine saying that Rama, Krishna, Arjuna, the Crusaders, the Saracens who fought against the Crusaders, imagine saying that these were not spiritual men. That's insane. They are among the most spiritual men in history. So you have to purge your mind of the concepts of what a spiritual person ought to be according to liberalized religions and spiritual systems, because the spirit of the age is what a spiritual person will connect with, and whatever their individual role in this life is, they will find it by being self-aware. Whether you are a teacher or a warrior or an engineer or whatever you are, you will become the best version of that possible the more spiritual you become. You will not change most of your core personality. You will simply subjugate your personality to your spirit and use your personality like a very effective instrument, an instrument of divine will. That personality has a place. You don't dissolve your personality into quiet pacifism. Becoming calm doesn't mean you become a pacifist. A warrior remains calm on the battlefield. A spiritual, self-possessed warrior is very calm on the battlefield, even though they are in a frenzy and a crazy combat situation. They are internally calm. A lot of people have mistaken this idea of calmness and serenity for actually behaving with pacifism in the external world. That is another misconception of spiritual practice. Real spiritual practice will not pacify you, unless you are for some reason or other meant to be a pacifist. If that is the core aspect of your personality and the instrument that the divine will needs for some particular purpose, then sure, it might be your path to be pacifistic for some specific goal that does actually help develop our culture. But in general, all I'm saying is that spiritual practice makes you who you are more deeply, and that it will be individual. And you will have a special role to play that is only yours. And you will not be this individual within a collective that all has to conform to some idea of what people believe a spiritual person is like, or a political person is like, or a good person is like, or whatever. So as long as you are doing what you do and you maintain perfect inner serenity and calm, you can carry out authoritarian politics. It doesn't mean you're loveless or compassionless. It means you have compassion for your culture and your people, and you suppress enemies and cultural distortion. That is what it is. This is the path of the autocrat, the benign dictator, an aristocratic personality, essentially an empowered white magician. So I just wanted to leave you with that, because a critical mass of empowered white magicians can effectively deal with the normies, the masses of humanity who are mediocre black magicians, and steer the culture in such a way to improve for the future and not prematurely end or become an anti-human, anti-spiritual civilization, but maintain our connection with the spiritual hierarchies and fulfill essentially the covenant that humanity has made, that we all made with the spiritual hierarchies. So thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. Have a good day.